I am probably accused of having too much hope in your generation coming up. I'm often accused of that, but that's why I'm in this course, and particularly on some topics, I think my hope is pretty strong in what your generation's thinking. For example, on this topic, I read your reflections, and there was pretty much universal agreement that we have a problem. Now, how we solve the problem, none of us are entirely sure. We need creativity, innovation, entrepreneurial ideas. But that we have a problem with our energy dependence on fossil fuels, leading to a number of other problems like climate change, a foreign policy we talked about last week that really isn't working, an impact on the poor far beyond their contribution to the problem, and so on. We have a problem. And when I was in Sweden earlier this year, I had a great session one night with the youth leaders of all 5 political parties in Sweden, the whole left to right gamut. And it was a very young audience, but I was in a dialogue with the youth leaders of the parties. Now, these are kind of European left to very conservative people, but they all agreed that the environment was a serious issue. Now, they had different ideas about how to fix it, but the conversation wasn't whether we have a problem, but how to fix it. Let me just say, as clearly as I can, the adults are not going to fix this. The adults are not going to solve this problem. The adults in Washington, in particular, are not going to solve this problem. This one really is likely over to you. I want to do the case study today of the BP so-called oil spill. The BP crisis that you all lived through, this isn't sort of ancient history to read about. You went through this. You were in school during this time. You talked to your friends. You have thoughts about this. I thought this might be a teachable moment, as they sometimes say, a moment in time. And to quote what Rich Cizik says about this issue, even an epiphany, as Rich had one earlier, this could be an epiphany for the country, which is a religious term, as many of you know. It's called just a wake-up call. A wake-up call, a moment of change, conversion, rethinking something at a deeper level. It has not become that. And I want to talk about why. So I saw these unbelievable pictures of swaths of brown oil mixed with the blue waters of the Gulf of Mexico, dying wetlands and marshes and miles of contaminated coastline that could have gone up into the Atlantic had it not been capped. Dead birds, animals, and helpless, feeling helpless and hopeless Gulf residents who really were, they thought, to be losing their whole way of life. So the explosion and sinking of the BP oil rig. Afterwards, the talk, of course, in Washington was technical fixes, environmental threats, economic losses, and who's to blame. And who's going to pay for it. The failure on every level, public and private, was immense. At moments, the government and BP admitted they didn't know how much oil had even gone into the Gulf. They weren't sure. It was full of underestimations and deceptions, and clearly BP had taken shortcuts, had not followed their own safety procedures, and it was a matter of timing and time frame and profits and all of the rest. An old story. But who was responsible? How bad would it be? A hurricane, when I was there, I think I mentioned to you, I went down there with an interfaith delegation. There are Christians, there were rabbis, pastors, imams, and we actually went out on the waters in kind of a flotilla of faith leaders on these fishing boats with unemployed fishermen, and talked to a lot of residents down there about what was going on. And they were afraid that the hurricane season was about to come in, and we were spared that. But literally, if a hurricane had come, it would have dropped not just water, but it would have dropped oil all over the Gulf Coast, in people's homes and buildings and businesses. And water dries and cleans up, and oil doesn't. We were spared that hurricane, gratefully, but that would have been a multiplying of the disaster many-fold. So, theologically, many of us, as we saw all this, said to each other that we were witnessing not just an oil spill, but really a massive, in our language, a massive despoiling of God's creation. That we were meant to be stewards of the Gulf of Mexico, of the wetlands that protect and spawn life, of islands and beaches and all of God's creatures who inhabit this marine world. And we were watching the destruction of all that because of this greed for profits and these deceptions and lies, which were very, you didn't need Anderson Cooper to tell you that people weren't telling the truth about all this, of both private and public irresponsibility. And I would assert at root, and this is assertion for discussion, at root because of an ethic of endless economic growth fueled by carbon-based fossil fuels that is ultimately unsustainable and unstable. My assertion we can discuss. And I was suggesting in some of what I asked you to read that BP wasn't just lying, that BP is a lie, which is deeper. That we can continue to live this way, that our style of life is stable and sustainable, and these huge oil companies are really committed to a safe and renewable energy future. G.K. Chesterton, who is one of my favorite authors, was once asked, what was most wrong with the world? And he reportedly replied with an answer that you never hear in Washington, D.C. He said, I am. I am what's most wrong with the world. Bryn's paper, you said you were sick of all the hypocrisy around all this, and I loved the passion in that paper. Well, this is what Chesterton's talking about. You know, who is responsible for all of this? I think BP has criminal responsibility for what they did, but it isn't just BP. It goes far beyond BP. That's why I say BP is really a lie, and it's a lie that many of us have participated in. So we say we want a clean energy economy, but that will, as I said in the readings, require a rewiring of the energy grid, yes, but also rewiring of our habits, our demands, our expectations, our assumptions, and all the rest. I use the word addiction, and that was raised by some of you. I think it's a good conversation. I remember being on Chris Matthews and Hardball during this crisis, and he was talking about who's most to blame, Obama, BP, you know, the usual Chris Matthews question. And I said, I think we have to go deeper than that and talk about our virtual addiction to an economy, an energy powering of the economy, addiction to oil and fossil fuels. And addictions, we know in the faith community, often require interventions. I don't know if you've all, I'm sure, any group this large knows about addiction. Family, friends, you probably learned about addictions. It often needs an intervention to solve an addiction. Chris said, well, Reverend Wallis, you're going a lot deeper than we normally get on this show. And I said, yep, that's the problem. That's the problem. Tom Friedman, New York Times columnist, during the Great Recession, he asked this, a deeper comment than even Tom normally makes. What if the recession is telling us the whole growth model we created over the last 50 years is simply unsustainable, economically and ecologically, and that 2008 was when we hit the wall, when Mother Nature and the market both said, no more. The great spill, you might say, makes the point even further. So who will lead the way toward responsibility, for change, for accountability, for civic mobilization, to protect endangered waters, coasts, species, people's livelihoods? But on a deeper level, who will lead the way toward a conversion of the habits of our heart and our lifestyle choices? Somebody will have to lead the way. It was a very powerful experience being down there. We took this little journey onto the water, and we had these fishermen who were unemployed because 80% of the fishing had been just shut down and stopped, and each of them was piloting one of our boats. So my captain was Kevin. He'd been on the waters for 30 years himself as a fisherman. His father before him had taught him the bayous and the ins and outs of the waters. His father before him taught him, and his 8-year-old daughter wanted to be a fisherwoman, but there was no fishing. And we left that morning from the port, and it was really beautiful. You could see why, when they say way of life, you can see what they mean. It was just gorgeous. The sky, the water, the marshes, the air. He said every day is different on the water. Every day is different. You can see why he was so in love with this place. When we got a little ways, he said, "You smell that?" And my urban nose didn't. But before long, we all did. The smell of oil. It was everywhere. And then we saw it, just this ugly coat of oil on all the marsh grasses, these estuaries. I said to Kevin, Kevin, what happens when that happens? When the oil gets in there? He says, well, it will ultimately kill everything. It'll just kill everything. The people in New Orleans feed the country with some of the world's greatest seafood. I think they provide 60% or something of our seafood. And to see people waiting in line for food at food lines, at churches who normally provide food, was almost too much for them to bear and for us to watch. And the perpetrator of all this, BP, was, of course, in charge of the cleanup. So they were the hirer of all the cleanup people and boats and forces. So you're dependent even on your perpetrator for your employment. I asked Kevin how that made him feel, and he just shook his head. I was asked by a reporter on the boat. CNN came with us, so it was this normal situation of the captain and you and CNN, and the reporter said, "Was this disaster an act of God?" And I was really offended by that question. This is entirely a result of human folly and human choices with very human consequences. And if you think Kevin is brokenhearted at what has happened, imagine how God must feel about what has happened to God's creation. If you think those who've lost their jobs and their livelihood and maybe their futures are mad, imagine how angry God must be when we fail to take care of a creation like this. But being down there, it was so vivid, it was so powerful, so clear, so morally clarifying to me to be down there, that I've been around this stuff a long time, issues in public life and all that, but I have to say, I felt like, as one fisherman said to me, if they ignore this, if this doesn't change how we think and how we act, whatever will. Whatever will. And I was being drawn into that this could be a moment of a wake-up call, epiphany, conversion, change, and Washington might even pay attention. And I came back, and what was already a very inadequate energy bill went down to defeat during the crisis. And the needle, if you will, the needle on concern about these issues didn't move just even a fraction during the crisis. Then Obama gets on TV and he says, for decades we have known the days of cheap and easily accessible oil were numbered. The president said, this is an Oval Office speech. For decades we've talked about the need to end America's century-long addiction to fossil fuels. Addiction, he used the word. For decades we've failed to act with the sense of urgency that this challenge requires. Time and time again, the path forward has been blocked, not only by oil industry lobbyists, but also by a lack of political courage and candor. The consequences of our inaction are now in plain sight, the president said. Then he continued, today we look at the Gulf, we see an entire way of life being threatened by the menacing cloud of black crude. We cannot consign our children to this future. The tragedy unfolding on our coast is the most painful and powerful reminder. Yet the time to embrace a clean energy future is now. Now the moment for this generation to embark on a national mission. He used that word. The president used the word mission to unleash American innovation and seize control of our own destiny. So that night, on Jon Stewart, I was reminded that Obama wasn't the first president to say this. There have been 8 presidents who said virtually the same thing. Obama, Bush 2, Clinton, Bush 1, Reagan, Carter, Ford, and Nixon have all called and promised to end our dependence on foreign oil. I think it's time to call this an addiction and to ask what an intervention might look like. So when we use that word mission to unpack the president's language a bit, there are a number of things that could include. It could include changing the practice of seeing oceans as mere drilling opportunities for our insatiable addictions, instead of an integral part of God's creative ecosystem, to use theological language. As somebody put it well during the crisis, our addiction to oil is leading us into deeper and deeper waters, they said. It's just, as we all know, it's not as safe to drill in deeper waters as more shallow. So what they were saying was leading us in deeper waters, and I don't know if they recognized the deeper meaning of what they were saying. Leading us into deeper and deeper waters. Or a mission to change an economic ethic based on growth at any cost to one governed by the ethics of sustainability. And this, we'll get into this later, but I raised this at the Wharton School of Business, hardly a hotbed of socialism and Marxism, this summer at their leadership conference. And, I said it was going well. We had a good 2-hour session on the book and other things. I said, I'd like to overhear you all, as CEOs, talk about the need to move from an ethic of endless growth to an ethic of sustainability. And the nodding heads in the room showed me that they didn't have all the answers, but they thought that was, in fact, a fair question for the business community. Or changing the kind of recklessness and greed that we've seen into accountability, and even talk about the common good, a wonderful Catholic notion. To talk about government, public accountability, and from this cozy relationship between political appointees looking for future work and with the industries they're regulating. If you look at who's doing the work, they're all really job applicants for future jobs in the industries they're supposed to be regulating. All that came out during the crisis. How about changing the vocational trajectory of millions of our poorest youth from flipping burgers to retrofitting a whole society for a clean energy future? How about changing that one? Or a foreign policy, as we said last time, based on dependence on corrupt oil regimes, on sending our sons and daughters off to fight and die for a very crude product, even though their motivations are very different, and both fueling and paying for a violent terrorism that is finally used against us. Just look at, I don't have the numbers here, but the billions of dollars that we pay directly to Saudi Arabia every year, every single year. And for all the conversation about Islam and all the rest, it's not happening in Indonesia. Saudi Arabia is the hotbed for the terrorism. And we literally are paying for it. And it's never said out loud, but follow the money. And that's where it's being birthed and being paid for by our dollars. It would take a mission to change that, and all the interests that keep it going in Washington, D.C., change a culture to find ways of living, thinking, working, transporting, and even how we measure success. And as I said, changing our very spirituality to rewire ourselves. And finally, the issue many of you raised in your readings, what is the hopeful possibility of the role of the faith community in all of this? If somebody must lead the way, who might we expect to do it? So I'm going to finish with just 3 quotations. They're not things I've said, but things I lifted up in the readings that I think are very poignant for us to discuss. One is the Anglican Bishop of Liverpool, Jim Jones. James was here just this fall, and I hosted him for a session over at Sojourners. But in the book, I quote him as saying, "Just as we look back on previous times with incredulity and wonder how people, especially believers, could have not only condoned but succored the slave trade and slavery, so in later years I think subsequent generations who will live consciously with the reality that the earth is not a limitless larder will find it difficult to understand how we could have described ourselves so uncritically as consumers," says James Jones. And then Brian McLaren, who I think is very insightful on all these things, says what he calls a stewardship economy doesn't see every majestic mountain as a potential site for strip mining operations, nor does it see forests as board feet of marketable lumber, nor does it see the spring-fed this spring-fed emerging wetland drained and bulldozed as a lucrative site for a housing development. Rather, whatever we own, quote unquote, is really lent and entrusted to us by God, received by us and reverently used for a time. And what Brian's, I think, revolutionary words suggest is a break with what is the old dominion theology. Finally, this is ours to have dominion over. We own this to use and abuse in whatever ways we choose. Finally, Bill McKibben says, parts of the faith community are stepping up to the challenge with real vigor. Not only evangelicals, but also Unitarians, Presbyterians, Orthodox Jews, and everyone else who can feel the horror of the decreation, I love that word, decreation, we're now engaged in. But we need more religious involvement, because it's one of the ways we can show wavering members of Congress that this isn't an alternative movement, but instead comes straight from the heart of America, and straight from the heart of the gospel tradition, with its paramount call for love of neighbor. And I'll finish with this. At the moment, the 4% of us in this country, that's our part of the world, produce a quarter of the world's carbon dioxide. Once you look at maps of rising sea levels and spreading mosquitoes, you realize that we probably never figured out a way to hate our neighbors around the world much more effectively. And says McKibben, this has got to stop.
I think one thing that really blocks an honest policy conversation about clean energy and climate change is that clean energy is framed as this very left-of-center issue. I remember after the oil spill, Rush Limbaugh said that, since the oil spilled in the ocean, it'll just disappear. It doesn't really matter. But the reality is that there are security implications for our addiction to oil. There are economic implications, and I don't think those arguments are being made loud enough.
One reason I brought Rich in for next week is to dispel that myth. Bill McKibben would have come if I asked him if he was free. Bill is a left-of-center environmentalist. He's amazing, but he does fit in the old category. Rich was a conservative evangelical on all kinds of issues, and this issue struck him as a faith issue, not as a left-wing politically. And he'll say more about that. But James Jones, a bishop in Liverpool, is an evangelical Anglican bishop. He's not a lefty in all kinds of ways. So until this issue becomes more than, you're exactly right, perceived as a left, like same with poverty. If caring about poverty is a left-wing issue, we're never going to get there. So how do we have some issues rise above this ideological food fight and be deeper than just left or right?